And I think it was important to get a broad perspective on what is happening in terms of fragmentation in the world economy, what the costs might be, what are some of the ways in which we should put some disciplines on the process as countries are looking to increase the resilience of their supply chains and enhance national security.
This is a particularly rewarding conference this time because it has many more people from different parts of the world and we're getting different perspectives. And that's not always been the case with the International Economic Association. So this is more wider, and I think therefore there are very interesting sessions on the state of the world economy, the directions of it, looking at history, looking at the significance of what history can tell us about what we are dealing with today. And particularly remembering that this is a change in which the global economy, you can learn from history, but you also have to recognize that this is a whole new world. And therefore, the standard kinds of ways we have used of looking at it are no longer relevant.
So I think probably the main message is that diversity is beneficial, in part because we can learn from others and we can learn from other cultures. And the cultures that we have within our tradition or within one particular group, because the world changes so much, might not be the culture that is best for the world today. And there might be other cultures or other ways of thinking, other worldviews that are better suited. And if we can learn from those, it's going to be a more efficient transition to the new challenges that a new world is bringing to us.
That we're in an extremely difficult and challenging situation in the global economy, and that there's a lot to learn by comparing the current situation with the original Cold War. And we don't really know whether we're moving to a 2 or a 3 block world. So I think the interconnection between economics and politics is a complicating factor. But the strength of economic ties, even across political divides, may be a cause for hope.
Bienvenidos de nuevo a Colombia, a Antioquia, a Medellín y sobre todo a esta casa de conocimiento que es EAFIT. Disfruten mucho estos 5 días.
Good morning, everyone. It's fantastic to see you all here. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Danny Quah, who's going to continue the discussion that was begun yesterday on global fragmentation and how we should think about that. And he's going to inject a particular perspective coming from the smaller countries. So I don't really need to spend time introducing Danny, so I won't. Just to say that his work has always been, it's across many subfields in economics, and it's always been question and curiosity driven and often ahead of the curve. So think back to the mid-1990s and the weightless economy. So over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Wendy. What I want to talk about is, of course, Asia's new trajectory, Asia's new growth trajectory, navigating the new international economic landscape, where that landscape is characterized by a fragmentation, a fracturing due to great power rivalry. In line with the title of the talk, I will cover 3 parts. First, I want to present some data on an old subject, growth and convergence, but perhaps done in a slightly different way. Second, I want to share with you a particular view on what the new international economic landscape is, how that's different from the old one. And then third, I want to, as the title of the talk suggests, present to you some ideas or some principles on ways in which all our nations can navigate this new fragmented international economic landscape. These three parts I'm going to cover, but there is one overarching message. And in order to try and bring across that single large overarching message, I'm going to take shortcuts. I'm going to cheat on some of the things I'm going to discuss here. As economists, we want always to be careful to provide nuance and subtlety in the conclusions we drive at, because our models are complicated and present different effects. I'm going to glide over a lot of those subtleties when I talk about these three things, because I want to get to the one large message. What is that large overarching message? That message is that world order, the international economic and political landscape, world order, the international system, is an endogenous variable. That world order changes going forwards because of economics. That we, as economists who are concerned about the way the global economy is going, we cannot take world order as exogenously given and then seek to navigate what is best for us in that exogenous landscape. We need to turn around our thinking and say that that landscape, that world order, will change according to the economics that changes. That depending on how trade and investment flows evolves going forwards, the new world order will need to adjust correspondingly. So in this regard, this talk takes a view that's slightly different from many others. There are many others who might talk about how world order has changed, it's become more fragmented. We're now in an era of great power rivalry. The United States and China are contending with each other for hegemony in the world, and we all need to either choose sides or figure out the best way to navigate this conflicted landscape. Or a version of that is that there's a new Cold War out there, and we need to condition our behavior taking that Cold War as given. My talk is about how we cannot take that Cold War as given, but instead, the historical developments that I want to survey in part 2 of the talk will suggest to you that that international system will be adjusting according to our responses in trade and investment. And we cannot take the Cold War, we cannot take great power rivalry, we cannot take the new international landscape as an exogenous variable. We cannot take that as given, but we want to see how our actions will influence how great power rivalry and world order evolves. Okay. That's what the talk is going to be. There are going to be 3 parts to the talk that I'm going to glide over many of the subtleties and nuance because I want to get to that overarching message, which is how we can exercise agency in great power rivalry. How great power rivalry is something now that will adapt endogenously to our actions. So first, let me tell you the 3 parts of the story. Growth and convergence with identity is how I'm going to begin. Growth and convergence is a long-established idea. It's a long-established set of empirical analyses. We are used to the idea of how we've run cross-country growth regressions, or we've studied the distribution of incomes across countries. We've studied how different patterns emerge from that. But to think about navigating the new international economic landscape, I want to look at growth and convergence with a new lens. And that new lens is one that conditions on identity. In other words, we need to think about growth and convergence with identity. We need to think about how when we study large-scale changes that are permanent, decades ago, Stephen Durloff and I and many others tried to think about those issues from a perspective of growth, of stationarity and ergodicity. And we had argued at that time that those were nuisances. They prevented us from doing econometrics. Today I want to stand here and tell you that those are not nuisances, but they're actually the most informative part of growth and convergence. So let me show you what I mean by that by looking at some empirical analyses. The punchline that I'm going to get through, which as I said is one that's going to glide over many subtleties, is that there are a number of characteristics that define Asia's economic growth trajectory. That in those parts of Asia that are successful, and many parts of Asia are, they show high savings and investment, they emphasize trade and market access, there are elements of industrial policy. The question here is not whether industrial policy is done or should be done at all, it's how it is best done if we're going to do it. The elements of technology transfer, and throughout all of this thinking, there's the underlying principle of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, there are many papers which ought to be written about how all of these fit together, and many of them have been written, but let me show you the outcome of this. So this is what I mean by slicing and dicing the data that we're used to thinking about, but in a slightly different way. This is a graph that shows the ratio between the combined national incomes of almost 200 emerging economies to the combined income of the richest 7 countries, the G7. Okay. I said a few minutes ago that there was a time when I would look at the graph like this and worry that it was non-stationary, non-ergodic process, and that was a nuisance. And I said that I want to turn that around now and say that actually that nuisance is the most interesting thing about these data. You'll see that in these data, the ratio of almost 200 countries to the 7 richest countries was flat for decades. The combined income of the emerging economies throughout the era when we thought development had already taken hold was actually rising only at the same rate as the combined incomes of the richest 7 developed countries. This ratio was basically flat between 1980 and 2000. In 2000, something very important happened, and that numerator, the combined national incomes of almost 200 emerging economies, started to rise as a ratio to the G7, to a point where by 2010, they had reached parity. Now, of course, you can say, well, comparing 200 countries with 7, it's hardly a fair comparison, but that's exactly my point. Decades ago, we had no problems comparing 200 emerging nations with the 7 richest ones and then saying that that ratio was flat. We had no problems coming to that conclusion. But then this started to change. That ratio began to change to when the emerging countries had almost reached parity with the G7. Now, when we think about this a little bit more, we'll say, well, yeah, but. Well, the but is, isn't that mostly just China and a few other nations? Well, yes, it is true that China was a large part of this globalization lift, but there were other nations in Asia that were coming along for the ride, whose incomes were rising. Let me show you a different way in which these data can be sliced and diced. This is a map that shows the evolution over time of the world's economic center of gravity. What does that mean? That means that you look at over 1,000 points on Earth, on the surface of our planet, 600 cities, 300 rural areas, where economic activity is measurable and changing to a point where it shifts the needle on the center of gravity. So if you think about 1,000 points on the surface of our planet, and then you treat the GDP or economic value being generated at each of these points, track that over time, and then calculate the weighted average in space of where the average location is, that's the picture that comes out. For almost all of the 20th century, to nobody's surprise, the world's economic center of gravity was firmly in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The global economy was transatlantic. It was mostly North America and Western Europe. There was a little bit of bright activity in Japan and some other smaller parts of the world, but most of the world was transatlantic. The fact that global governance emerged from the transatlantic part of our planet was simply a convergence between the geopolitics and the geoeconomics of our planet up until the late 20th century. From 1980, the world's economic center of gravity picked itself up off of the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between Western Europe and North America, and steadily started tracking east. This is not just growth as usual in a stationary sense. This is growth that changes the fundamentals of the distribution of economic activity on our planet. And that economic center of gravity started drifting east. By about 2015, this was from a paper that I had where I presented these calculations in 2011. By 2015, when the Economist newspaper redid these calculations, they confirmed that the world's economic center of gravity, which used to be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for most of the 20th century, was now in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, to be very clear, it's not that everything is happening in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in the early part of the 20th century. And it's not that the global economy was converging on Saudi Arabia by 2015. It's that that is the weighted average of the location of all economic activity on our planet. A simple extrapolation shows that by 2050, within all our lifetimes, the world's economic center of gravity will be in time zone GMT plus 8. It will sit on the border between India and China. It will be a profound change in the way the economics of our planet operates. Let me show one of the ways in which this could change the way our planet operates. See, because if you take the 9 billion people on our planet and you ask them what are the problems that politics, social systems, economic organization should solve, and you put it to a vote among all of the population of the planet, if the world were a democracy, the problems that would concern the world would be where there's the greatest location of human population. That is, of course, not in the transatlantic region, but by a calculation that I did early in 2015, that smallest place on our planet that locates a democratic majority of humanity is a circle 3,300 kilometers in radius, centered in Shan State, eastern Myanmar, again on near the boundary between China and India. It contains 50% of the world's population. A different way to think about what's happening here is that this is convergence on a grand scale, because the world's economic center is converging to the world's population center. The only way that, well, there are many ways that can happen, but a sensible way that can happen is that if the income distribution goes flat, there is convergence. And there are minor ripples, but this is what's happening in the world. Change in the world over the last century has been directed, has been part of a great convergence, and has been a huge move in the geopolitical understanding that we can have of our planet. Okay. So that's the slicing and dicing of data. I'd said that growth and convergence is an idea that we're long familiar with. Many of us in this room and elsewhere have done analyses of growth and convergence. What I've given to you uses exactly those same data, but it slices and dices in a different way. And it tries to look at the locations on our planet, identity on our planet, identified by names of nation states where interesting economics is happening. And we come up with some simple conclusion. I am gliding over so many subtleties and nuances, but here's a way to think about what's happened. Convergence has in fact occurred. Small states, which make up most of what this pool is, then towards the east of the distribution of economic activity on our planet, are converging, are becoming richer. They are converging with the great Western European per capita incomes previously seen after the Industrial Revolution only in the transatlantic economies. And it's true that part of that shift eastwards is because of 2 billion people economies, China and India, both of whom have also turned out at different points in history to be the fastest, among the fastest growing of developing economies. But it's also the case that small states, which are in a lot of Asia, are extremely successful. The state that I live and work in now, Singapore, only has 3.5 million people. It's 1/400th the size of either India or China. It's smaller than Chicago. But its per capita income is the 4th highest in the world. And you might say, well, Singapore is an outlier. Here's the thing. The first 3 countries in the world that have higher per capita GDP than Singapore, their populations are even smaller than Singapore's. Small states make up a lot of economic success in the world. And recognizing the direction in which this has occurred, recognizing the way in which the global economy has changed, helps us think about how increasing returns, large economies are more successful, operates not in always the most obvious of ways. The reason that small states are successful is because even though they can't make everything that they want to consume, and they make too much of certain things that they don't need, they're able to get around this through international trade, economic exchange. Economic exchange is what's allowed small states to be so successful. Economic exchange, international trade, is Asia's success story. That is so obvious for China, it is so obvious for Singapore on different parts of the population spectrum. This gives rise to a theme of how the global economy needs to be stronger together. Whether it's through trade via traditional Ricardian ideas of comparative advantage or through ideas of complex emergence or otherwise, stronger is together. So, very traditional thinking about why Asia is successful, gliding over many different subtleties, but all well-established sets of ideas. Conclusion, powerful convergence in the large. Now I want to get to where the international economic landscape is fractured or fragmented, and why this disrupts the story that I've just told, why it is such a powerful disruption to what's happening here. Okay. Now, when I said stronger together, when I said small states are successful despite what are apparent disadvantages from their being unable to leverage increasing returns to scale, generating the best ideas at the frontier, and many, many other things, there's one word that many in Asia think about, and that is globalization, by which we mean the increasing ease with which everything, everywhere, is available to anyone, anywhere on the planet. That is what is the core of Asia's central success story. So the critical thing is, at this point, globalization is not an exogenous variable. Globalization came about because of directed geopolitical considerations, for the same reason that in a couple of minutes I'm going to get to say that we cannot take the international fractured economic landscape as a given. We need to be thinking about how that has to change. But 50, 70 years ago, the way in which globalization emerged as an endogenous variable was because there was a nation that thought that was the way the global economy should go. America identified political liberties, human freedoms with the freedom for economic exchange. Milton Friedman was a powerful interlocutor of that idea. And America grew the idea that the world needed to look like the United States. It gave rise to the idea of the American century, that if the world of the 20th century and going forwards is fit for purpose, it must be just like the United States. And the United States operated this principle to devastating success. John Eikenberry, who is not, to be very clear, John Eikenberry is one of the great liberal internationalists. He's not someone who's saying, oh, America must go out and conquer the world. But he, writing in the mid-2000s, acknowledged how America's unparalleled dominance, precedence in the world, was unquestionable. And that together with its views on political and human individual freedoms, the ability to do economic exchange, combined with what I said to you earlier of Asia's characteristics combine to lead to this powerful convergence in the direction of Asia. The story, of course, doesn't end here because that is no longer the America that sits in the United States today. America does not view the American century going forwards in the same way that it viewed it 70 years ago or 30 years ago. Very obviously, America is no longer the cheerleader of globalization. In fact, the language in the United States in terms of the geopolitical landscape is very far from the kind of geopolitical landscape that I said Asia rested its success on. Talk today is of decoupling, deglobalization, de-risking. And all of this directed in a particular direction, directed at China. This change in the geopolitical temperature has led to what many think of as the greatest foreign policy challenge of our time. Now, if my point is to try and convince you that the actions that all nations take in terms of trade and investment co-move and help determine the geopolitical landscape, I cannot simply say, well, the geopolitical landscape changed and we have to take that as given. I have to say a little bit about why it changed, because it is understanding that we can then think about why it might change in a different direction, why a new world order might emerge that's different from either the globalization, American century one, or a deglobalization, US-China deadly rivalry one. But if we think about the evolution of thinking on this takes us out of a lot of what we do as economists. The people who think the most about how world order evolves, about what determines world order, not us economists, they're international relations scholars. They're international relations scholars who use historical examples and ideas and models that are very different from ours. Well, I'm going to say there's a relation, but it's not one that we recognize right away. So many scholars talk about this new economic landscape as being a result of a theory of power transition. There's a theory of power transition because at every point in history, there's a hegemon, there is a dominant power in the world, and that dominant power watches over the rest of the world, and when it sees other great powers rising up towards it, converging towards it, in economic capability, in political power, political capacity, it feels threatened, and the tendency, the risk of the prosecution of international violence increases in a contest, in a deadly contest between competing great powers. This is so-called power transition theory, and there's a set of ideas in international relations that goes back 2,000 years. The Greek historian Thucydides, which many of you might know because Graham Allison, a Harvard political scientist, wrote a book called The Thucydides Trap, where he described how in history, examples of such great power transitions almost always came hand in hand with international violence. This is also sometimes known as a tragedy of great power politics, associated with a school of thinking known as realism. But it's not the only way to think about how endogenously global power, global systems might evolve. There's a security dilemma, which international relations scholars talk about, which is like a prisoner's dilemma game, where one nation starts to arm itself and makes more insecure its competing nation, that then also sets off a cycle of arming each other. There are at work in the world today considerations of nationalism in the United States and nationalism in China. China, there's talk of a great national rejuvenation and never a return to a century of humiliation. In America, there's talk about how our values must prevail in the world. Our values of democracy, human liberty are now at risk. So there's an idea that there are national considerations. Personalities are involved. Donald Trump was a US president that completely changed the way US-China relations worked, as much as Richard Nixon, decades ago, transform the world of conflict between the United States and China into one of collaboration and cooperation and trade. Personalities matter. For economists, we want to be mindful of these different international relations considerations, but we also appreciate how what makes for world order, the international system, to change is that there are economic forces at work. One of the characteristics of the American century that I described very quickly, the globalization that came with that, was the idea that America then, as benevolent hegemon, set out rules of the game, set out the rules of world order, set out a rules-based system, enshrined in the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and the Bretton Woods institutions. And these determined how world order evolved its rules. Economic considerations lay beneath a lot of these. And when today, different parts of the world think about how the international system needs to change, it is because there is a perception that the rules of the game are no longer fair. They're being exploited by one great power versus another. They're being exploited by other nations. The rise of Asia, which I tried to describe to you vividly, is sometimes interpreted as being a situation where the rules were bent and the playing field was not level, and that different parts of industrial policy practiced in many different parts of the world were at odds with the understanding of the rules of the game. As if all of these changes were not enough, of course, we've just come through the COVID pandemic, and we've experienced firsthand, we've seen how this national discourse on engagement with COVID-19, how different nations treated the pandemic, treated the way their populations had to deal with the pandemic, gave rise to nationalism and a breakdown of the idea that the international trading system, globalization, could be relied on. The pandemic, together with this growing mistrust in the world because the idea of rules of the game being exploited, led to where nations began to think of pulling back their networks of the global supply chain, coming to rely more on domestic suppliers rather than anonymous providers from some far-flung country across our planet. It changed the tone and the temperature with which we described globalization. And then finally, there's just the heat of economic competition. In economic competition, as in all competition, there are winners and there are losers. And we hope that the rules of the game, the rules-based order, lead to behavior when there's winners and losers, where the losers do not hold a grudge, the winners do not act in a triumphalist way, but everybody wishes each other well and then go on to the next contest. This idea that competition is constructive and positive in this way is now seriously under challenge. Every nation that feels it's losing is seeking to claw back advantage in some other way. So the heat of economic competition has changed the way globalization is now treated. Now, how do I use these theories and these ideas? Well, let me just focus on one specific thing, because a large part of what I've just described here has to do with the US-China rivalry. There's no two ways around it. But in a second, I'm going to try and suggest to you that the US-China rivalry is not the end game of deglobalization, is not the end game of the end of the American century. Something more sinister could be at work. But if we stay here at this point and just try and think about US-China rivalry, there is of course the idea in many parts of the world, in a political narrative in many parts of the world, not just in America, but in many parts of the world, that China is evil. That because it is authoritarian and Leninist, the state and the party control human lives, show a disdain for human rights and free speech, do not conform to our understanding of liberal values and basic human decencies, will carry forward that national practice to the international stage. That the rules-based order will now potentially be undermined by a revisionist power that seeks to change the international system and reshape it in their authoritarian image. That China is a bully using economics to gain its way from other smaller nations. That China has unbalanced the global economy, has destroyed our jobs through a China shock, has hollowed out our industry, steals our intellectual property. Now, one of the challenges in trying to think about how this world order evolves is there are many different forces going on. There's the US-China rivalry, for which this China is evil narrative. There's a corresponding America is evil narrative that many of us in the rest of the world are familiar with. There is, at the same time, there's more general ideas about pandemic resilience, about pulling back the global supply chain, about not necessarily trusting international trade the way we used to. There are many different forces. And part of what we need to do, if we try and unpack how fragmentation is occurring in the international economic landscape, is we need to unpack these forces. There's not just one force at work. Okay, so let's establish some facts. I'm now going to go over some empirical analyses before I come to the concluding part, which is how we can see ways through to exercise agency in influencing how great power, how world order will evolve going forwards. A first fact to establish is that if there is deglobalization, this is a picture that captures that. This is a picture that shows the ratio of world trade to world GDP. And we see how over the decades of the American century, the globalization era that I described to you, the rise of Asia era that I described to you, world trade as a fraction of GDP consistently rose and rose sharply. And then it stopped. And it has been flat ever since. If anything, it's on a slight downward decline, but not significantly. It's mostly just flat, following a big shock. The big shock, however, is 2008. The big shock was the global financial crisis. It was not Donald Trump. It was not the rise of the China is evil narrative that I just quoted for you. It goes all the way back to the global financial crisis. So if there is deglobalization, and we feel that Asia and all other parts of the world need to navigate that new landscape, it is not necessarily one that has to do with great power rivalry. It's simply a change in the way the global trading system behaved after the global financial crisis. That would be one tentative conclusion. But let me suggest that tentative conclusion is too hasty. Because it is true that if we take that as our index of deglobalization, the big disruptor was the 2008 global financial crisis. But talk of de-risking and decoupling since Donald Trump and a range of policy measures around the world has been all in a single direction. And it's been all about China. This is a graph that shows China's share of US imports. It's been rising over all of these decades. It did not see a significant change in trend after the global financial crisis. 2008 might have been the great disruption for international trade and globalization, but it was not the great disruption for China's imports into the United States. What was the great disruption? 2018. Donald Trump and the emergence of a new narrative on China's place in the world. That point on, China's share of US imports has been on a sharp, steady decline. And it's not just trade, it's investment as well. US investment, foreign direct investment into China has fallen off a cliff, and correspondingly, China investment into the United States similarly so. The United States today imports more goods from Mexico than China. These two graphs show first a convergence and then an overtaking. Now, of course, part of that is USMC, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. Part of that is possibly a diversion of economic activity from the province of Shenzhen in China into Mexico, which is now simply re-exported into the United States, and that would be a reflection of what Gita Gopinath yesterday referred to as a lengthening of the global supply chain. But there's no question there's a disruption in trade patterns in the direction of China. When you look at the change in trade patterns of who's selling what to the United States now, it is all about a loss in China and a pickup from other parts of the world, Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, India, into the United States. So this suggests a slightly more complicated story for us, one that says it is not, if it is deglobalization, well, it's not, because deglobalization was something that had been happening since 2008. Is it about China? More likely so. So what's going on here? Okay. So I want to conclude from this that there are different forces at work. There are different forces at work in this changing international fracturing, fragmenting international landscape, and it's not easily characterized by just deglobalization or decoupling or de-risking. There are many different things going on here, but a critical message that I take from this is that we cannot take the global understanding on trade and investment as a given, because it constantly continues to change, and there are multiple forces that drive it. America's own history on its approach to international trade has long been a complicated one. We remember the era of America building the American century. We remember the era of America pushing the international institutions into globalization and a rules-based order. But actually, for most of its history, America has far from been a trading nation. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury of the Secretary, and now a best-selling musical, said that trade with the rest of the world was impracticable. Abraham Lincoln, the great liberator of slaves in the United States, considered protectionism to be a strong point of how the United States had to run its policy, because Abraham Lincoln, 2 years after the repeal of the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom, said, give us a protective tariff and we will give you the greatest nation on earth. The US Republican Party platform said that protectionism is the bulwark with which American strength, prosperity, our industry is built. America has a long and complicated history relative to trade, and it might well be that what we're seeing is a return to that era, and the halcyon days that we remember of the American century, pushing globalization, leading to the rise of Asia, is actually a very brief shining moment in American history. Okay. So let me conclude on this bit. There's sometimes a complacency that's developed in the rest of the world, because they might look at these figures that I've given and say, well, you know, US-China rivalry, not a big deal. Because you see, there's no great change in globalization in the world. There is, but it goes all the way back to 2008. It doesn't have to do with US and China. And actually, all this de-risking, decoupling, this de-Chinification of the global trading system is now just good for us, the rest of the world. So in Asia, and I suspect everywhere else in the world, there's often talk of a China plus one strategy, which is that we diversify. China is the number one trading partner of pretty much every nation everywhere in the world, everybody in Asia. But we seek a diversification. We'll do China plus Vietnam, China plus India, China plus one. And if you follow that China plus one thinking, it might well be in a premature way that you come away saying, deglobalization, not a big deal, de-Chinification will work for us. Because China plus one strategy means that as China diminishes, we, the Vietnams or the Indias, will ascend in importance. But here's my warning. If you think that the way in which America's policy on trade and investment and globalization in the world has changed, it's not because of a personal animosity towards China, but instead it's because of the idea that America's economy is now competing with a rival that actually leads it in a number of different industries and dimensions. The same way that Germany considers trade with China awkward now, because China now leads Germany in a number of technologies. If that is the approach that the world takes to globalization, then the +1 strategy provides no safe harbor, because everything that China is criticized for in the US economic narrative is true also of pretty much all the nations that are +1s. Everything that China does, all the other nations do as well. Vietnam, India, Indonesia, in a large part of Southeast Asia. So if you think that the way in which we're going to come out of this fractured economic landscape is through a +1 hedging strategy, that will soon no longer be available as well, because if there was a China shock, there will also be a +1 shock soon. Okay. So all of this is rather dismal. Where exactly do we go from here? Okay. If I may, let me just take 3 minutes to finish up. How do we navigate this fragmenting and actually more and more complicated international landscape, where the story is not simply a simple one of deglobalization or US-China rivalry, but there are many different dimensions? So I say, I come back to the idea that the trading nations of the world, the nations who still see economic benefit to exchange, those nations that continue to believe the world economy is stronger together, needs to figure out ways in which we can exercise agency to either circumvent great power rivalry, convince the great powers that the deglobalization strategy needs to be appropriately adjusted. How do we do that? Okay, so here I won't be labor going through some of the theoretical analyses, but let me describe some of the key ideas here. If we think that the United States and China constitute a key part of the way in which rivalry between them is leading to an unraveling of the global economic order, we also want to recognize that 80% of humanity actually lives in neither China nor the United States. In line with what I showed you earlier about the democratic majority located on our planet, most of the world does not live in the two great powers that we have put so much emphasis on in thinking about fragmentation of the world. 80% of the world lives outside. This is not to suggest that therefore 80% of the world should stand up and offer themselves as a nuclear protagonist, instructing America and China to behave better. But it says that other nations, and let me call them third nations, because if there's a number one and number two nation going at it with great power rivalry, third nations outside that need to exercise agency. And the way in which we want to do that is we need to divide up the domain of disagreements between great powers that lead to deglobalization into problems of positive sum payoffs, zero-sum equilibria, and prisoner's dilemma situations. And the world is forever locked into these kinds of challenges. Collaborating with each other on global climate crisis is a positive sum game. We just don't do enough of it because we have a tendency to free ride. Confronting each other over considerations of national security is a zero-sum game because what one nation wins, the other nation loses. Those two things, most of us know how to deal with. The third category are problems of prisoner's dilemma situations, where you will all know that although there are Pareto optimal outcomes that are achievable, in equilibrium, the world collapses into a lose-lose situation. And what third nations need to do when the great powers get themselves into a gridlock in prisoner's dilemma situations is to nudge these great powers by exercising a little bit of side payment payoffs to move the world away from a bad equilibrium of prisoner's dilemma outcomes to a better equilibrium of Pareto efficient outcomes. So the navigation that we need to work on as economists is a description of the global problems where third nations can exercise agency and move us away from the terrible situation that we're in with deglobalization and de-Chinification, different forces, but all at work, reducing efficiency and reducing the well-being of the global economy. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Danny. That was a very big tour, and I think you've taken us a long way in trying to understand the implications of the great power transformation. Danny encouraged me to share a few slides, so I will do that if they're ready. Yes, okay. So this is just really a visualization of what Danny was talking about. And he was really stressing the fact that economics cannot take geopolitics as given. And what we see on the left here is the high supply of global public goods sustained by high trust. And we've got the blue is the geopolitics, but the red is the economic dimension. So they reinforce each other in this kind of virtuous circle. But we can equally find the opposite situation where we get what Danny has called very, I think in a very vivid way, epic loss. So this is where you get the relationship feeding back into a downward spiral. And this made me think about how we could kind of visualize the problem in terms of a dynamic model where we have two stable equilibria, those two. We're thinking about the global goods supply in period T along the horizontal and in T+1 along the vertical. So these two stable equilibria are along that 45-degree line. And what we have is then this S-shaped dynamic relationship, which you've seen in many other settings, poverty trap settings, bank failures, and so on. But I think it's illuminating, and it helps illuminate perhaps the point that Danny was making, that what happens when we have a transition of global powers, we have a downward shift of that dynamics curve. So we have a new stable equilibrium with a lower supply of global public goods, so the situation's already deteriorated, and we've got a narrowing of the gap between that good, reasonably good equilibrium and the tipping point. So the situation has taken on the kind of dynamics that Danny was referring to. And then this helps us, I think, picture the point about third nations. So what the third nations can do is to effectively mitigate that downward slide of that S-shaped public goods dynamic curve, keep pushing it up to try and salvage the good equilibrium. So there may have been some deterioration, but we don't get pushed past the tipping point. And what I was going to ask Danny was really to give us a little bit more and maybe some more concrete examples of what those third nations can do in order to mitigate that downward slide and the increased risk of slipping into the low global public goods equilibrium. So Danny, do you want to come back on that?
Well, thank you, Wendy. The idea that third nations can have an impact on this is something that is quite inconsistent with a lot of conventional international relations thinking, where the idea in those is often something like the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. And that thinking is what this theory of third nation agency seeks to overturn. Are there examples of this, of where third nations have been important? It turns out that there are. In something called the Ottawa Treaty, that works on the non-proliferation of landmines, anti-personnel devices, it was not the great powers that came together and said, we need to rid our world of landmines. It was Canada and 50 of Canada's closest friends among third nations who started to then build a movement that led to eventually even Joe Biden coming on board. But at the end of the period where Biden then agreed that he would work to rid the world of the deployment of landmines, in this regard, Russia did not sign up to the Ottawa Treaty, nor did China. Nor I think did India and Pakistan, although the last two I'm not entirely sure. So there is an example in modern working diplomacy of where third nations have been able to exercise agency in changing the way the world works. My other favorite example, of course, is the original Thucydides trap, because Graham Allison documented how Sparta and Athens went to war because Athens was the rising power that threatened Spartan hegemony. And Sparta and Athens fought this terrible war, at the end of which Athens was defeated and Sparta was exhausted. But within 10 years after that, the other city-states, the third nations, Thebes and Corinth, rose and objected to the way Sparta was running its hegemony. And then they sacked Sparta, because Sparta had so exhausted itself in this great war against the other great power that it completely lost sight of what third nations could do. That is, I do not recommend that, by the way. I do not recommend third nations going to war with the great powers, far from it. I'm using it as an example by which we cannot ignore what the rest of the world thinks. Even as great power rivalry runs its course, third nations will continue to feature prominently.
And is that also the case with economic pacts like ASEAN and those organizations?
Yes. So one of the great ideas in economic pacts was TPP, which of course you all remember Donald Trump tore up the first day he became president. But TPP emerged not as an American idea, not as a Western European idea. It emerged because 4 nation states thought that it was a good idea to have a trans-Pacific trade partnership. Those nation states were Singapore, Brunei, Chile, and New Zealand. Tiny, tiny states, third nations, that then through their actions completely changed the way the world's trading landscape might have looked, if not for Donald Trump's act.
One question, or if it's quick, 2 questions from the audience. Who wants to ask Danny a question? Yes.
Well, I was just doing some inquisitive thinking, and I would like to get your comment. We mentioned that there's some decoupling, deglobalization, and the shrinking of the total world trade, or maybe not the total volume, the share of trade shrinking in some of the nations' total GDP. But I think this is a natural consequence of the slowing growth of the major countries after the 2008 financial crisis, because there was already some...
if you could just move to your question, that would be great.
Yes, I'm trying to wrap up. Because after this crisis, there was already, and before even the crisis, there was some growth problems, technology and efficiency problems in the industrial nations, and this was already causing some pressure upon growth. And this crisis was indeed a way of overcoming that pressure on growth and efficiency and new technology paradigm. So I think this is a natural consequence. This is not a policy reversal to a more closed and less trade economy, but rather a consequence of the growth problems reflecting on the trade and investment policies of the world. So I think what we need is not new rules and regulations that free the trade and capital movements, but rather maybe some more growth and technology and some new paradigm over the growth of the industrial world.
So three quick things to say in response. One is that you're right, after 2008 there was slowing down of all major economies, but remember the statistic that I presented was trade over GDP. So what you're describing is the slowdown of the denominator. The slowdown of the denominator alone would have led to that ratio rising, not remaining constant. So the slowdown in trade is even worse because of the slowdown in growth in the economy. Second, my point is that if you believe that there is deglobalization, then my point is that you need to go beyond just deglobalization, because the way in which trade patterns are changing, it's not just a generalized reduction of trade across all countries, it's a reduction of trade very sharply in one direction of the world and actually a pickup of trade with other parts of the world. So whether or not deglobalization is actually happening, it helps some of what I'm saying, but it's not critical.
Thank you very much. We should stop to finish on time. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks again to Danny.